Picture this. You have just single-handedly torched 14 German Tigers. You halted a breakthrough that threatened to wipe out the entire division. You are waiting for a medal, but instead, a pistol is pressed to your temple, and a military prosecutor is demanding your immediate execution. Why did the Soviet government want to kill a hero of the Kursk salient an hour after his feat? What deadly act of sabotage did a sergeant in a foxhole commit to turn a useless cannon into a doomsday weapon? This is the story of how one criminal experiment with gunpowder saved the front, why physics turned out to be more important than regulations, and how violating a direct order saved thousands of lives, but nearly cost the inventor his own. A screech. It wasn't the roar of a detonation, not the guttural howl of a high-explosive shell churning up the earth. It was the scream of metal losing a fight against physics. A steel slug slammed into the frontal plate of a German tank and shot up into the sky as a meaningless spark. A ricochet. At a distance of 500 meters, it sounded like a death sentence read out in the grinding of steel. The barrel of the Zis-3 gun jerked, absorbing the recoil. The breech block ejected the smoking casing with a clang. It fell into the dry, scorched grass, ringing like a funeral bell. The loader, a young kid with a face white from dust and fear, was already reaching for the next shell. His hands were shaking. It wasn't panic, it was physiology. His body understood what his mind refused to accept. They weren't the hunters here. They were the prey. July 1943. The Kursk salient. The air trembled not from the heat, but from the density of the sound waves. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, transmitting the heavy tread of dozens of tons of German armor. Senior Sergeant Ivanov pressed his eye to the panoramic sight. In the eyepiece, a gray wall was trembling. That wasn't a figure of speech. The German Tigers weren't moving like they were in combat. They were moving like they were on parade. A steady formation, short stops, fire, move. Cold, calculated mechanics of destruction. Ivanov saw the turret of the lead tank turn slowly, lazily in their direction. The muzzle brake of the 88mm gun looked straight into his soul. "Ricochet!" The gunner's scream broke into a wheeze. "Ricochet again, Comrade Commander! It's not penetrating!" Ivanov remained silent. He had nothing to say. He knew the tactical and technical characteristics of his gun better than the names of his own children. 76mm divisional gun, model 1942. Reliable, simple, fail-safe. The workhorse of the war. But right now, that horse was dead. Standard armor-piercing round BR-350A, mass 6.5 kilograms.
Muzzle velocity, 662 meters per second.
On paper, in the quiet of the proving grounds in 1939, those were impressive numbers. Here, in July of '43, those numbers were an epitaph. The frontal armor of a Tiger was 100 millimeters of high-quality Krupp alloy steel, plus the slope angle, plus the distance. The kinetic energy of the Soviet shell simply wasn't enough. Upon impact with the German forehead, the slug either crumbled into dust or slid off the surface, leaving only a scratch on the gray paint. It was like throwing river pebbles at a steel safe. You can't fool physics with patriotism. If mass times acceleration is less than the strength of the armor's crystal lattice, you are dead. "Load!" Ivanov commanded. His voice sounded alien, dry as sand on teeth. The loader shoved the shell into the breech. The click of the lock sounded unnaturally loud in the split-second pause between explosions. The gunner spun the hand wheels, trying to aim for a weak spot. The vision slit? The track? The turret ring? Theory said there were vulnerable zones. Practice showed that hitting them under fire when your hands are shaking from adrenaline and the ground is slipping out from under your feet is a lottery with one winning ticket in a million. Shot. The gun jumped, its spades digging deeper into the soil. Another screech, another spark. Son of a bitch! The gunner slammed his fist on the carriage. 700 meters! We're hitting point blank! Why isn't it burning? The German tank didn't burn. It didn't even slow down. It just kept crawling forward, relentless as a glacier. Ivanov saw the Tiger's driver turn the hull slightly. Now they saw only the massive, impenetrable front. It was a mockery. Engineering superiority embodied in metal. The Germans knew they couldn't be penetrated. They felt like gods in their armored boxes. The trench smelled of burnt gunpowder, sour sweat, and urine. Fear here wasn't an emotion. It was a thick substance you could cut with a knife. The crew understood. The German machine's next stop would be the last for their gun. An .88 caliber high-explosive shell would turn the cannon into a pile of twisted scrap metal, and the men into biological mince. "Armor-piercing!" Ivanov shouted over the roar of the cannonade. "We're out of armor-piercing, Comrade Sergeant," the ammunition carrier yelled back. "Only fragmentation left, and no sub-caliber." Ivanov looked at the casings littering the ground at his feet. Brass cylinders still holding the warmth of propellant gases. Empty. Useless. They had done everything the manual prescribed. They fired. They didn't run. They held their position. But the manual was written by humans, and they were fighting against machines that didn't give a damn about those rules. 500 meters away, death was moving toward them. Multi-ton death, growling with a diesel engine. Against it, Ivanov had 7 crew members, half a crate of fragmentation grenades that were no more dangerous to a tank than a mosquito bite, and a sense of total, crushing powerlessness. It was a dead end, a technical dead end of 1943. Soviet artillery had fallen behind. The race between armor and projectile had been lost completely. At this specific moment, on this specific field near Kursk, heroism was worth nothing. You could stand tall, you could throw yourself under the treads with a bundle of grenades, but it wouldn't change the main fact. Their weapon didn't work. Ivanov wiped sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. His eyes stung. In his head, through the roar of battle, a single thought pulsed, cold and clear as a theorem. If you can't break force with force, you have to change the rules. If kinetics don't work, you need a different energy. Another shell struck the ground 10 meters from the parapet. Shrapnel pinged off the gun shield. The Germans were bracketing them. They had minutes remaining, maybe seconds, before a heavy, high-explosive shell scored a direct hit on the crew. "Take cover!" Someone from the infantry on the left screamed, but the artillerymen stayed at their posts. There was nowhere to run. Behind them was the court-martial. In front of them were the Tigers. Ivanov looked at the breech of his gun. The metal was hot. The grease was bubbling. This weapon was created by engineers who hadn't seen these new German monsters. But right now, here in the mud and smoke, he had to become the engineer himself. Or they would die. The sergeant's gaze fell on a crate of non-standard ammunition they had hidden at the bottom of the trench under a tarp. Prohibited shells. An experiment for which their own side would execute them. But when 56 tons of invulnerable steel are crawling toward you, fear of the prosecutor fades into the background, giving way to the cold rage of a cornered beast. The armor isn't pierced, but now the enemy wasn't the Germans. Here began the war against the manual. Pain clears the brain better than ice water. When you're lying on a dirty sheet with shrapnel pulsating in your leg, the world narrows down to simple truths. Either you find a solution, or you cease to exist. Ivanov's memory threw him back 3 months. March 1943. A field hospital near Kharkiv. The smell of carbolic acid, pus, and cheap tobacco overpowered even the smell of death that had eaten into the walls. His neighbor on the bunk was a thin, bilious artillery captain with crushed hands. A former engineer from some factory in the Urals. He was dying of gangrene, but his brain worked with frightening clarity. They talked at night when the pain wouldn't let them sleep. The talk wasn't about women or home. The talk was about metal. "You don't understand, Sergeant," the captain wheezed, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. "We are fighting a safe with a crowbar. Kinetics is the past. The future belongs to the directional explosion." That was when Ivanov first heard the index. BP 350M. A cumulative shaped charge shell for the 45mm gun. The soldiers called the 45s the Farewell Motherland guns. They were useless against the new German tanks. Their light shells bounced off the armor like peas. But the new ammunition changed the rules of the game. The engineer explained the mechanics on his fingers, wincing from pain. Inside the steel slug is a cone lined with copper. Explosives are packed around this cone. Upon impact, the detonator triggers instantly. The blast wave collapses the cone, turning the copper into a thin jet of molten metal and gas. The pressure at the point of impact is millions of atmospheres. The speed of the jet is kilometers per second. "It doesn't care about thickness," the captain whispered. "It doesn't care about the hardening of the steel. The jet doesn't punch through armor. It washes it away, like a stream of water washes away sand. Hydrodynamics, Ivanov. It's not an impact. It's a burn-through." Ivanov listened and memorized. He had a 7th grade education, but he felt iron with his skin. He understood. A shaped charge shell doesn't need high flight speed. It doesn't need acceleration. It just needs to carry the charge to the target. You could throw it by hand, and the effect would be the same if the fuse worked correctly. But there was a problem. The BP 350M was created for the regimental gun, model 1927. It had a short barrel, different ballistics, different pressure in the bore. "What if we load it into a ZIS-3? Ivanov had asked then. The engineer looked at him like he was an idiot. "It'll burst," he answered briefly. "The casing is different. The powder charge in the 76 caliber is too powerful. The walls of the shaped charge shell are thinner than a solid shot. When fired from a long-barreled gun, the G-force will deform the shell right in the barrel. Either the propellant gases will break through, or the shell will crack before leaving the muzzle. Instead of a shot, you'll get a flower of torn metal. And the crew goes to heaven." The captain died 2 days later. But the idea remained. It sat in Ivanov's head like a splinter that couldn't be pulled out. Now, in a trench near Kursk, that theory was taking on flesh. Ivanov went over the construction of the unitary cartridge in his mind. Casing, primer, powder charge, projectile. Everything calculated in design bureaus. The weight of the powder measured to the gram. Changing it was a crime. Article 58, Section Sabotage. Execution. But Ivanov looked at the German tanks and understood. The design bureaus were far away, but death was right here, 500 meters out. The engineers in the rear couldn't hear this grinding. They couldn't see the 76mm solid shot crumbling into dust. The sergeant's brain worked like a computer in overdrive. Input data. There are captured and borrowed shaped charge shells from regimental artillery. There are casings from the ZIS-3. If you just combine them, the barrel will burst from excess pressure. The shell is too fragile for the full powder load of a divisional gun. The solution didn't come as an epiphany, but as a dry, technical conclusion. Reduce the charge. Lower the pressure of the propellant gases. Ivanov imagined the pressure graph in the gun bore. He had never seen these graphs on paper, but he felt them with his hands every time he pulled the lanyard. A sharp peak at the beginning, a smooth drop toward the muzzle. He needed to cut off that peak, make the push soft. It was sapper work with gunpowder. He had to open the casing, pour out part of the macaroni, the long tubes of artillery powder. How much? Half? A third? If he removed too much, the shell would get stuck in the barrel. If he left too much, detonation in the breech. He didn't have a slide rule. He didn't have firing tables for homemade mutants. He only had a mechanic's intuition and animal fear. Fear not for himself, but that the gun would fall silent. "A third," Ivanov whispered. "I need to remove a third of the charge." It was pure empiricism, going all in. He was about to violate the main law of artillery: don't mess with the ammunition. The manual is written in blood. But right now, the manual demanded suicide from him, shooting useless slugs at invulnerable targets. Ivanov decided to write his own manual. The risk of a barrel burst was 50-50. The risk of being crushed by tiger treads was 100%. The math was on the side of the experiment. He remembered the hands of that engineer in the hospital, broken, helpless. He knew the theory, but couldn't do anything. Ivanov could. He was a practitioner. His hands didn't shake when he thought about how he would bend back the neck of the casing. It was just work. A hard, dirty, deadly dangerous locksmith operation. He had to act fast. The scheme was already forming in his head. Night. A rain poncho to hide the light. Pliers. And scales. Damn, he needed scales. No, there were no scales. He'd have to do it by eye, by weight. His hand had to remember the heft of a standard charge. Ivanov looked at his palms. Rough skin, ingrained oil, black fingernails. These hands could disassemble and reassemble a ZIS-3 breech with eyes closed. Now, these hands had to become a high-precision instrument. A mistake of 10 grams of powder could cost the lives of the entire crew, but the mistake of inaction would cost the lives of all the infantry behind them. The tiger in the sights canceled all prohibitions. The court-martial would come later, if they survived. And to survive, he had to turn the cannon into a tool that didn't exist in nature. Crossbreed the power of a 3-inch gun with the venom of a shaped charge jet. It was madness, technical heresy. Any military representative would have sent him to court just for the thought alone. But there were no military representatives here. Here, there was only armor and projectile, and the eternal dispute between them, which Ivanov intended to win by cheating the laws of physics. He inhaled deeply of the hot, dusty air. The decision was made. All that remained was to execute it, to transform from a soldier following orders into an engineer creating death. There was no fear. There was cold calculation and the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders harder than crates of shells. It was time to move from theory to practice, to dirty, forbidden, saving practice. It happened 2 days before the German offensive. A deep ravine in the division's rear, used as a makeshift firing range for sighting guns after repair. The air here was still, smelling of wormwood and old iron. Ivanov looked around. No one. Only his crew, 6 pairs of eyes reading a mixture of curiosity and animal terror. They understood what their commander was doing. Under wartime laws, this was classified unequivocally: intentional damage to ammunition. Execution in front of the formation, without trial or investigation. But they were silent. They had seen what standard shells did to German armor. Nothing. And that fear was stronger than the fear of the special officers. The sergeant placed a brass casing with a regimental gun's-shaped charge on an ammo crate. Next to it lay tools: pliers, a hammer, a broken file. This wasn't a laboratory. It was a makeshift workshop on a knee, where the price of a mistake was measured in human lives. Ivanov picked up the casing. The metal was cold. He began carefully bending back the casing neck with the pliers. The brass yielded reluctantly, with a quiet crunch. The sergeant worked slowly, trying not to dent the edges. One wrong move, and the seal would be broken. The powder would get damp, and there would be no shot. Finally, the projectile gave way and came out of the casing. A sharp, chemical smell of artillery powder hit his nose. Inside lay long tubes of 7-channel powder, looking like macaroni. The fuel of death. For the short barrel of a regimental gun, this charge was sufficient, but Ivanov intended to fire from a long-barreled ZIS-3 divisional gun. Ballistics worked differently here. If the charge remained full, the pressure in the long-bore would rise so quickly that the G-force would simply crush the thin-walled, shaped charge shell before it even exited. Or blow up the barrel. Ivanov turned the casing over. The tubes spilled onto the spread-out poncho with a dry rustle. "What are you doing, Commander?" the gunner asked in a whisper. His Adam's apple twitched nervously. "Saving our lives," Ivanov grunted without raising his head. He separated about a third of the powder tubes from the pile. There were no scales. There was only his eyesight and the intuition of a man who had lived with artillery for half his life. He weighed the powder in his hand, feeling the grams with his skin. Take away too little, the breech blows to pieces, and they all get shredded by their own iron. Take away too much, the shell gets stuck in the bore, and the next shot turns the gun into a daisy. He needed the golden mean, the balance between power and safety. Ivanov swept the excess powder into the pocket of his breeches. He carefully returned the rest to the casing, trying not to break the brittle tubes. The most critical moment. Inserting the shell back, crimping the neck, making it so the casing would enter the chamber like a factory original. He tapped with the hammer through a wooden spacer, millimeter by millimeter, restoring the geometry of the manufactured item. "Done," he exhaled. Large drops of sweat stood out on his forehead. He lifted the modified cartridge. It looked like a normal shell, but inside was different physics. The reduced charge should gently push out the shaped charge grenade, preventing it from crumbling under G-force, but giving it enough spin for stabilization. "Load," Ivanov commanded. The crew froze. No one moved. "Load, I said," the sergeant barked. "Or do you want to croak tomorrow when the tigers come rolling in?" The loader, crossing himself, took the heavy shell. The breech block clanged, closing the chamber. That sound seemed deafening to Ivanov. Ahead, 300 meters away, stood the wreck of a knocked-out Soviet KV-1 tank. Thick armor, powerful turret. The perfect target. Ivanov sat in the gunner's seat himself. He wouldn't trust this to anyone. If the gun blew up, only he would die. He chased the crew out of the pit. "Take cover! Everyone, take cover!" He pressed against the panoramic eyepiece. The crosshairs settled exactly on the joint of the turret and hull of the dead tank. His hand lay on the firing lever. His heart beat somewhere in his throat, echoing in his temples with dull thuds. Everything would be decided now. Either he was a genius or a corpse. His finger pulled the lever. The shot sounded strange. There was no familiar sharp crash that blocked ears and showered dirt down your collar. The sound was duller, softer, as if the cannon had coughed. The barrel recoil was lazy, short. Didn't exit, a terrible thought flashed. Stuck. But in that same second, on the armor of the KV, right where the crosshairs looked, a blinding flash blossomed. There was no scattering of shrapnel, no cloud of dust. There was only a short, vicious concentration of energy in one point. Ivanov jumped out from behind the shield. The gun was intact. Smoke was drifting from the barrel in a thin stream. The breech remained in place. Alive. "To me!" he yelled to the crew, who were already peeking out of the bushes. "Run to the target!" They ran across the field, stumbling over bumps. Ivanov got there first. He ran his hand over the armor of the dead tank. The steel was hot. In the side of the turret gaped a neat hole the diameter of a small apple. The edges were melted, as if someone had poked a red-hot finger into butter. No cracks, no dents. Clean work. The jet of molten metal and gas had simply evaporated the steel in its path. Ivanov looked inside the hole. Darkness. But he knew what was in there. Ultra-high pressure, temperature in the thousands of degrees. The crew, had they been there, would have died instantly from the pressure jump, even if the jet hadn't touched anyone.
See that?
Ivanov turned to his men. His eyes shone feverishly. See how it went in? Like butter. The soldiers looked silently at the hole. They touched the melted edges, not believing their eyes. A standard solid shot would have left a dent and flown off into the sky. This thing had stitched through 100 millimeters of Soviet steel. "Comrade Sergeant," the loader whispered, That's a court-martial. We violated regulations, ruined ammunition." Ivanov straightened up. He looked at his people. Dirty, tired, frightened. Tomorrow or the day after, a steel avalanche would come at them, an avalanche that didn't care about regulations. "The court-martial comes later," he said harshly. "Tomorrow brings the battle. Do you want to live?" The soldiers exchanged glances. In their eyes, fear of the brass began to give way to hope. Hope that they now held something in their hands that could kill these invulnerable German monsters. "We do, Comrade Commander," the gunner answered quietly. "Then here is what we do," Ivanov enunciated every word. "We open every shaped charge we find. Pour off a third of the powder. The scales are my hands. An error means death. Anyone who blabs, I'll shoot them myself. Clear?" "Clear," the crew exhaled in unison. "Get to work. We don't have much time." They returned to the gun in silence. Now they were bound by a single secret. A secret that weighed a few kilograms of gunpowder and smelled of salvation. In that ravine, far from headquarters and generals, a new, unofficial doctrine of war was born. A doctrine of survival through breaking the rules. Sergeant Ivanov was no longer just a gun commander. He had become the chief designer of his own fate. And the fate of the German tanks, which did not yet know that a weapon was being prepared against them that wasn't supposed to exist. Ivanov walked last. In his pocket, he clenched a handful of artillery powder. The small cylinders dug into his palm. This was the price of victory. Excess powder that hindered killing the enemy. Now he knew the secret. All that remained was to apply it when the earth trembled for real. The night of July 11th into the 12th, 1943, descended on the Kursk salient like a heavy, stifling blanket. The silence was such that the whine of a mosquito seemed like the sound of a diving bomber. But this silence was deceptive. The earth hummed. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon line, on the German side, hundreds of tanks were warming up their engines. Diesel growls, the clatter of tracks, German speech, all of it merged into a low, barely perceptible vibration transmitted through boot soles straight into the spine. In the deep trench of Sergeant Ivanov's gun crew, work was boiling. This wasn't preparation for battle according to the manual. It was the commission of a criminal offense by a group of persons in a conspiracy.
Article 58 of the Criminal Code. Sabotage.
Undermining the military power of the state. Punishment, the highest measure of social protection. Execution. A poncho stretched over the bottom of the trench hid the dim light of a homemade oil lamp. In the wavering, trembling flame, the soldiers' faces looked carved from stone, covered in a layer of soot and dirt. Hands, black from gun oil and earth, moved with the caution of neurosurgeons. On the canvas lay 20 shells, 20 brass casings, 20 chances to survive the coming hell. "Quiet," Ivanov hissed when the loader clinked his pliers too loudly against metal. "If the special officer hears, they'll put us against the wall before the Germans wake up." The air in this improvised underground laboratory was thick, saturated with the chemical smell of pyroxylin powder. This smell ate into clothes, hair, skin, the sweet, sharp scent of death. Ivanov methodically, one by one, took the shells.
His movements were practiced to automatism.
Uncrimp the neck. Remove the grenade. Pour out the contents. The powder tubes, long, looking like dark, brownish macaroni, fell onto the fabric with a dry rustle. In every casing, death. But in the factory configuration, that death was meant for both the Germans and the gun. Ivanov was performing selection. He was cutting off the excess. He was reducing power to increase effectiveness. A paradox impossible to explain to a headquarters rat, but obvious here in the mud. He didn't use scales. There were none. His scales were his palms, calloused from working with breech blocks and shovels. Muscle memory, bred by years of service, worked more precisely than apothecary instruments. He knew the weight of the charge by touch. He felt when exactly a third was removed. "Comrade Sergeant," the ammunition carrier's whisper trembled. "What if it doesn't work? What if it gets stuck?" Ivanov raised his eyes. The lamp's flame reflected in them. "If it gets stuck, we die," he answered in a level voice, devoid of emotion. "And if we don't do this, we also die. Only before death, we'll see our solid shots bouncing off their armor like peas off a wall. Choose." The carrier swallowed and nodded. The choice was obvious. Better to risk a barrel burst than to be guaranteed transformation into a bloody mess under tiger treads. The work continued. Open. Pour out. Assemble. Crimp. Each modified shell was marked with chalk, a cross on the casing base, the quality mark of homemade production, a sign that this ammo was special. Ivanov looked at these crosses and thought that each one was a signed death warrant. If a commission checked the ammo load tomorrow, he was finished. No one would listen to explanations about gas pressure and ballistics, damage to state property, sabotage. But the fear of execution retreated before the animal horror of the impending attack. Ivanov remembered that sound, the sound of a ricochet.
He dreamed about it. The screech of steel going into the sky. Impotence. Tomorrow he didn't want to hear that screech. Tomorrow he wanted to hear a different sound. The sound of tearing German armor. 20 casings. 20 shaped charge grenades transplanted into the bodies of divisional rounds. This was their gold reserve, their insurance. "Last one," the gunner exhaled, handing Ivanov the heavy cylinder. The sergeant took the shell. His fingers habitually found the edge of the casing. The metal was warm from the soldier's hands. Ivanov performed the operation for the 20th time. Pour out the powder, return the grenade. Tap the edges with a wooden mallet so as not to leave traces of the break-in. Now the casings lay in a row, gleaming in the dim light. 20 deadly surprises. They looked just like regular standard rounds, but inside them was a different chemistry. The chemistry of desperation and precise calculation. "Hide them," Ivanov commanded. "At the bottom of the crates. Standard high explosives on top, so no dog can sniff them out." The men began packing the shells into wooden crates, layering them with oiled paper. Everyone's hands were shaking. Not from cold, the night was stifling. From adrenaline. They had just committed what the manual forbade under pain of death. They had crossed a line. Now they weren't just soldiers of the Red Army. They were conspirators. A gang that decided to survive at any cost. Ivanov wiped his hands with a rag. Black, oily streaks remained on the fabric. He looked at his watch. 2:30. Dawn soon. Soon that for which they had gathered here would begin. The greatest battle of motors in history. And in this battle, his small crew, lost among thousands of others, now had an ace up its sleeve. The silence outside became ringing. The birds were silent. Even the crickets had quieted down, as if sensing the approaching storm. Nature was holding its breath. Ivanov lit a smoke, hiding the glow in his sleeve. The smoke mixed with the smell of gunpowder. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "Doze for at least an hour. Tomorrow will be a long day." No one lay down. They sat leaning against the damp walls of the trench, hugging their carbines. Sleep wouldn't come. The same picture spun in their heads. A gray field, fog, and black silhouettes of tanks crawling out of it. The sergeant looked at the crates. There, under a layer of ordinary HE shells, lay his invention, the fruit of sleepless nights and fear. He didn't know if he would become a hero or a criminal. In this war, the line between a feat and a court-martial was thinner than cigarette paper. Everything depended on the result. If he burned the tanks, victors aren't judged. If not, the dead don't care. Somewhere far away to the north, lightning flashed. Without sound, just a burst of light illuminating the horizon. It had begun. Artillery preparation on the neighboring sector of the front. The ground beneath their feet shuddered, slightly, barely noticeably, as if a huge beast was turning in its den, waking up. Ivanov stubbed out his cigarette on his boot. "To the gun," he said. His voice was calm, mundane, as if he were calling them to lunch. "Wipe the sight. Check the recoil mechanism. Readiness number 1. The night laboratory closed. The time for experiments was over. The time was coming to test theory with practice. Bloody, fiery practice. Ahead was the dawn of July 12th, a dawn that for many would become a sunset, but not for them. Ivanov swore this to himself. 20 shells, 20 deaths in brass packaging. They were ready. They waited. And the darkness before them began to slowly turn gray, dissolving into the pre-dawn fog, from which the rising, guttural roar of thousands of engines could already be heard. The avalanche was approaching. The morning of July 12th began not with sunrise, but with vibration. At first, it was a barely perceptible trembling of dust on the parapet. Tiny grains began to roll down, obeying not the wind, but a tectonic shift originating 2 kilometers to the west. Then sound was added to the vibration. a low, guttural hum that vibrated the diaphragm and made teeth ache. It wasn't thunder. It was hundreds of Maybach engines working, churning the Russian earth into a greasy, black gruel. Fog lay in the lowlands in a thick, milky layer. It hid the horizon, turning the battlefield into a gray unknown. Sergeant Ivanov's crew froze at the gun. No one smoked. No one moved. Nerves were taut as steel cables, ready to snap at the slightest touch. They knew what was in that fog. They heard the clatter of tracks, a characteristic heavy metallic grinding that couldn't be confused with anything else. At 6 a.m, the fog began to tear. Like rotten fabric, it fell apart in tatters, revealing the terrible geometry of war. First, the silhouettes appeared. Huge, angular boxes crawling across a wide front. Tigers. They moved in a wedge, the classic German Panzerkeil. Heavy machines in the center, medium Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns on the flanks. It wasn't an attack. It was an avalanche. A steel wall moving at a pedestrian's pace, but with the inevitability of a tsunami. The neighboring battery on the left couldn't take it. Nerves gave way. "Fire!" came the hysterical scream of the neighbor's platoon commander. 4 ZS-3 guns fired a salvo. Flames burst from muzzle brakes, kicking up clouds of dust. The shells went toward the target. Ivanov, glued to his binoculars, saw the flight trajectory. Distance, 1,200 meters. For a 76mm gun, this was the limit of effective combat against heavy armor. Sparks. Only sparks. Armor-piercing slugs struck the frontal plates of the lead Tigers and went into the sky as meaningless fireworks. Ricochets. Kinetic energy at that distance wasn't enough even to leave a dent on 100mm armor. The Germans didn't even stop. They just continued moving, ignoring the shelling like an elephant ignores a barking pug. The answer wasn't long in coming. The turrets of the German tanks began to turn. Slowly, with the lazy grace of predators. 88mm. Long barrels, looking like telegraph poles, stared at the Soviet batteries' positions. Flash, whistle, impact. The neighbor's position disappeared in a cloud of black smoke and churned earth. The German gunners worked with surgical precision. A high-explosive shell hit right under the shield of the outermost gun. The cannon was tossed into the air like a toy, its barrel bent into an unnatural arc, wheels shattered into splinters. The men were gone. Just a moment ago, there were living artillerymen, and a second later, a crater and silence, overlaid by the roar of engines. Ivanov lowered his binoculars. His face remained a mask. Not a single muscle twitched, although inside everything clenched into an icy ball. "Comrade Sergeant!" The gunner gripped the aiming wheels so hard his knuckles turned white. "They're gonna bracket us now! We have to shoot! The distance is closing!" "Wait!" Ivanov's voice was quiet, but heavy as a tombstone. "They see the neighbor's flashes. They're gonna hit us any second!" The loader's voice broke into a squeal. "Open fire!" "Belay that panic," Ivanov barked without turning around. "Wait for the command." The German armada approached. 1,000 meters. 900. The ground around the trench shook so much that casings standing in the niches began to ring, hitting against each other. This ringing drilled into ears. The air smelled of burning, diesel, and animal terror. Infantry in the forward trenches had already begun to pull back, pressing against the trench bottoms. Against this steel mass, rifles and machine guns were useless. The infantrymen hoped for the artillery, for Ivanov. And Ivanov was silent. 800 meters. In the gunner's sight,
The German tank grew to monstrous proportions. Rivets on the armor were visible, spare tracks on the turret, even the tactical number on the side, 321. The muzzle looked slightly to the side, but Ivanov knew. Another second, and it would turn toward them. "Sergeant!" the carrier screamed, covering his head with his hands. "They'll crush us! Shoot, you bastard!" It was a mutiny born of the instinct for self-preservation. The body demanded action. Fight or flight. But Ivanov forced them to do the most terrible thing. Wait. "Silence!" Ivanov spun around to the crew. There was no weapon in his hand, but his look was scarier than a pistol. "We have 20 shells. 20. If we start now, we'll only scratch them. They'll spot us and burn us. We need to hit for sure. Point blank." "What point blank?" the gunner howled, not tearing himself away from the sight. 700 meters! He's gonna shoot! Hell was breaking loose around them. Neighbors on the right opened rapid fire. Useless. Shells crumbled against armor. The German machines answered methodically, knocking out gun after gun. The field filled with burning metal. Black pillars of smoke rose to the sky, blocking the sun. The screams of the wounded drowned in the roar of explosions. But Ivanov's crew was an island of unnatural silence in this ocean of fire. It was suicidal calm. Ivanov knew the ballistics of his homemade shells. Because of the reduced charge, muzzle velocity had dropped. The trajectory was less flat. To hit a vulnerable spot, he had to let the enemy get to pistol range. 500 meters. 400. Closer. It was a staring contest with death. Who blinks first?
600 meters, the gunner reported. His voice trembled. Tears flowed down dirty cheeks, washing away the soot. "I see the commander in the hatch. He's looking at us." Ivanov felt sweat flowing down his back in a cold stream. Every second of waiting cost a year of life. His heart beat somewhere in his throat, blocking his breath. He saw the turret of the lead Tiger start to turn, slowly, in jerks. Hydraulics working, aiming death. "Sight, constant! Aim, turret ring!" Ivanov commanded. "On the ring!" the gunner wheezed. Around them, the world was collapsing. Shrapnel whistled overhead, slicing off camouflage branches. The earth erupted in fountains. But Ivanov saw only one target, a gray steel slab bearing down on them. Now, or never. In this moment, the logic of war broke. By all rules, they should already be dead, or running, or shooting in panic, hoping for a miracle. But they sat and waited for the monster to come within knife-fighting distance. Ivanov wasn't betting on the gun's shield, which didn't exist. Not on the power of the gunpowder, which he himself had reduced. He was betting on a single, precise, lethal bite. 500 meters. The roar became unbearable. It seemed the tracks were clanking right on their skulls. "Load special!" Ivanov exhaled. This was the point of no return. The command that separated life from death. Standard war ended. Ivanov's experiment began. An experiment whose price was either a court-martial or victory, or a mass grave for everyone. The loader grabbed a shell with a white cross on the bottom. His hands shook, but he shoved the casing into the breech with the strength of desperation. The lock clicked. That click sounded like a starter pistol. Time compressed. All that remained was the crosshairs of the sight, the gray side of the tank, and the gunner's finger on the firing lever. The avalanche had come right up close, and now it was about to meet a rock it couldn't crush.
Fire!
Ivanov's scream tore the gunner's eardrum. The firing lever jerked down. The firing pin struck the primer. The igniter passed a spark to the truncated powder charge. Inside the chamber, exactly what the sergeant had calculated in his night lab happened. Pressure built smoothly. There was no sharp peak capable of bursting the barrel. Gases gently but insistently pushed the shell into the rifling, spinning it for stabilization. The shot sounded duller than standard. It wasn't the crack of tearing atmosphere, but a heavy, dense thump. At a distance of 400 meters, ballistics didn't matter. The shell went straight. It struck the frontal plate of the lead Tiger just below the driver's vision slit. There was no ricochet, no shower of sparks. A chemical reaction occurred, for which armor steel was not an obstacle, but a medium. In a thousandth of a second, the detonator triggered the charge. The copper cone inside the shell collapsed. A cumulative jet formed, a needle of superheated metal and gas, flying at a speed exceeding the speed of sound dozens of times over. For this needle, Krupp-hardened steel ceased to be a solid body. The metal flowed like water. The jet stitched through 100 millimeters of armor instantly, without losing energy. It burst into the fighting compartment, bringing with it monstrous pressure and temperatures in the thousands of degrees. The tank crew didn't even have time to realize what happened. The pressure drop turned their insides into jelly before they heard the sound of impact. But that was only the beginning. The superheated jet, having punched through the men, struck the Tiger's ammo rack. 88 millimeters of death, stored in casings, detonated simultaneously. The 56-ton machine jumped in place. Welds burst. The heavy turret, weighing 11 tons, tore off the turret ring and, tumbling in the air, flew aside like a lid from a boiling pot. A huge pillar of fire and black smoke hit the sky. "Got him!" the gunner yelled, not hearing his own voice. "He's burning, the bastard! Burning!" "Don't yell," Ivanov hit him on the shoulder. "Left 05. Next. Panther, side armor." This wasn't a battle. It was work on a conveyor belt of death. Adrenaline hit the blood, erasing fear, fatigue, and doubt. Only mechanics remained. Lever, breech block, casing, shell, lever. The loader worked like an automaton. His hands, scraped bloody, flashed in the air, shoving special shells with white crosses on the bottoms into the breech. He didn't feel the weight. 6 kilograms of metal seemed like feathers. He knew one thing. As long as the gun was firing, he was living. Second shot. A Panther trying to bypass the burning leader took a hit in the side. The shaped charge jet burned through the thin side armor and reached the fuel tanks. The tank flared up like a torch. Burning figures of tankers began jumping out of hatches, falling into the dust and rolling on the ground. The Germans were in shock. Their logic of war had broken. They were used to Russian guns being helpless at this distance. They went into the attack, confident in the invulnerability of their armor. And suddenly, this armor began cracking like eggshells. They didn't see the flashes of heavy guns. They didn't understand what was killing them. "Right, self-propelled gun!" Ivanov commanded, overpowering the roar. "That's a Ferdinand! 200 millimeters in the front!" A huge, self-propelled gun crawled straight at them. 200 millimeters of steel. An impenetrable shield. Even howitzers were powerless against it. But the physics of the cumulative effect knows no concept of too thick. If the jet is focused correctly, it will stitch through half a meter. The gunner caught the Ferdinand's casemate in the crosshairs. His hands no longer shook. Now they were the hands of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. Shot. The shell hit exactly in the center of the frontal plate. Again, that same sound, as if someone hit wet clay with a sledgehammer. The jet found a way. It drilled through 200 millimeters in a fraction of a second. The SPG jerked, stopped, and started smoking. A second later, thick, greasy smoke poured from the open hatch on the rear. An internal explosion tore up the transmission. The steel monster turned into a pile of scrap. The trench stank. Propellant gases didn't have time to ventilate. Eyes watered. Throats scratched as if filled with broken glass. But no one paid attention. The crew had entered a rhythm of killing. Load! Fire. Recoil. Load. 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes that stretched into eternity. 20 shells modified in a dirty trench changed the landscape of the Kursk salient. The field in front of the gun turned into a graveyard of technology. Black skeletons of tanks smoked, blocking the view. Ivanov commanded to shoot through the smoke, orienting by muzzle flashes and engine roars. "Armor piercing!" the carrier shouted. "Specials are out!" "Give me armor piercing," Ivanov responded. "Finish off the tracks!" The specials had done their job. They knocked out the backbone of the attacking wedge. The heavy Tigers and Panthers were burning. The remaining medium tanks, seeing the destruction of the flagships, began to back away, exposing their sides. Now ordinary physics came into play. Armor-piercing slugs, useless head-on, tore tracks perfectly and punched through the sides of the Panzer IVs on retreat. Every shot was accompanied by the ring of an ejected casing. These casings fell to the bottom of the trench, forming a ringing carpet. Sergeant Ivanov stood ankle-deep in brass. His tunic stuck to his body with sweat. His face was black with soot, only the whites of his eyes and teeth visible in a bestial grin. He saw the German attack choke. The formation fell apart. Panic, the very panic the Germans wanted to sow in Russian ranks, now seized them. Invulnerability turned out to be a myth. They were being burned. Burned brutally, methodically, at point-blank range. 14th, the gunner wheezed, following another flaring tank with his eyes. 14th is done! 14 destroyed machines. A mountain of burning metal worth millions of Reichsmarks. And all this was done by one cannon, 7 men, and 20 homemade shells with removed powder. The roar of battle began to subside. The Germans were retreating, snapping back with rare shots. They left their steel idols on the field, turned into funeral pyres. Ivanov sank down onto the carriage trail. His legs wouldn't hold him. The adrenaline storm began to recede, leaving behind emptiness and trembling knees. He looked at his hands. They were black, covered in abrasions and burns. These hands had just rewritten the history of one battle. The barrel of the ZIS-3 was red hot. The paint on it had bubbled and burned off, exposing gray metal. Heat shimmer rose from the muzzle brake. The gun breathed heat like a driven horse whipped to jump higher than its head. "Water," the loader whispered, sliding down the trench wall. Ivanov took out his canteen. The warm, stale water seemed like nectar to them. They passed the canteen around, swallowing greedily, spilling it on dirty chins. They were alive. They survived where they should have died. Around them, 14 German tanks were burning out. Black smoke rose to the sky in pillars, merging into one huge cloud. It was a monument to their audacity, a monument to engineering risk. But along with the silence came the realization of another fact. Ivanov looked under his feet. There, among the ordinary casings, lay 20 special ones, with shortened charges, with marks from pliers on the necks. Evidence. Physical proof of a crime. The battle with the Germans was over. Now the battle with the prosecutor lay ahead. And in this battle, shaped charge shells were useless. Ivanov understood. The euphoria of victory would pass in an hour, but the casings would remain, and the manual would remain, and the special officers hadn't gone anywhere. He picked up one casing. It was still hot. "Clean up," he said quietly. "Gather all the non-standard ones. Bury them." "Comrade Sergeant," the gunner looked at him with wild eyes. "Who's gonna touch us? We'll get medals. 14 tanks." "Bury them," Ivanov repeated. "Medals are for the dead. The living get prison terms. Get to it." They began crawling along the trench bottom, picking out casings with marks. But it was too late. From the rear, the noise of a motor could already be heard. The battalion commander's Willys was making its way through craters to their position. The time to cover tracks was over. The time was coming to answer for victory. Silence didn't descend immediately. First, the rhythm left. The breech block stopped clanging. The dry crack of shots stopped hitting the ears. Only ringing remained. A thin, nasty squeal on the border of ultrasound that lived inside the head. Barotrauma. Eardrums, raped by shockwaves, refused to perceive the world. Ivanov saw the loader's lips moving, but heard no sound. As if he were watching a silent movie about war, where the film jammed on the frame, the end. Smoke over the battlefield stood like a wall. It was greasy, black, tasting of burnt rubber and roasted meat. 14 bonfires. 14 steel boxes that just half an hour ago were the pinnacle of German engineering thought, now smoked, turning into scrap metal. The wind lazily drifted the soot toward German positions. There, behind the hill, the engines of surviving machines growled. The enemy had retreated. The psychological break turned out to be stronger than orders. When invulnerable tanks start blowing up one after another, pedantic German tactics crumble into dust. Ivanov tried to stand, but his legs were cotton. Muscles, burned out by adrenaline, refused to hold his body. He slid down the gun shield to the ground, feeling the heat of the metal with his back. The Zis-3 was dying, or resting. The barrel was so hot the air around it trembled, creating an optical haze. Protective paint on the breech and muzzle brake had swelled in black bubbles, exposing gray, petrified steel. The recuperators smelled of hot spindle oil. The fluid in the recoil mechanism had almost boiled. A couple more shots, and the seals wouldn't have held. Oil would have sprayed out, and the cannon would have turned into a useless pipe. The crew sat at the bottom of the trench, fetal positions, dirty black faces on which only tracks from tears washing away the soot were white. No one smiled. No one shouted hurrah. Victory in war looks not like a parade, but like a heavy hangover after a fight in a burning house. The gunner stared dumbly at his hands. His fingers were curled, frozen in a shape repeating the aiming wheels. He tried to straighten them, but the joints were cramped. "Water," someone whispered. Ivanov read it on the lips. He nodded at the empty canteen lying in the dust. There was no water, only dry thirst scratching the throat. Dehydration of an organism working at the limit. Ivanov shifted his gaze under his feet, and then he broke into a cold sweat, stickier than during the attack. The entire floor of the trench was strewn with casings, a brass sea. And among the dull, standard cylinders, 20 specials gleamed treacherously. They were different. Even now, in the gloom of the smoke, a professional's eye saw the difference. On the necks of these casings remained barely noticeable marks from pliers.
The edges were crimped slightly more roughly than factory ones. And most importantly, the primers. On some bases, half-erased chalk crosses were still visible. Evidence. Every such casing was physical proof for the Sabotage article. While the battle was on, it was salvation. Now that silence had fallen, it became an indictment. Hearing began to slowly return. Through the squeal, the crackle of burning tanks and the distant drone of planes broke through. "Sergeant," the loader's voice sounded like it was coming from a barrel, muffled and indistinct. "Look." The soldier nodded at the pile of casings. He understood everything, too. The euphoria that they were alive evaporated instantly. In its place came sticky, bureaucratic fear. The war was over. The army was beginning. And in the army, order is more important than results. Ivanov rose with difficulty. He picked up one of the special casings. It was heavy.
Inside it was empty, but it pulled the hand to the ground with the weight of responsibility. "Gather them," Ivanov's voice rasped, his vocal cords torn by screaming. "Fast. Well, no one is here."
"Where to, Comrade Commander?" The gunner looked at him with hope, like at a god who knows the way out of any situation.
"Into the tarp, and bury it. Over there, in the crater. Sprinkle dirt on top. And debris."
They began crawling on all fours, raking through the piles of brass. Hands that 10 minutes ago were sending death to German tanks now trembled, hiding traces of their feet. It was humiliating. Heroes who had to hide their weapon like thieves hide stolen goods. But Ivanov knew, if a special officer or someone from regimental staff came here now, there would be no one to explain the physics of the explosion to. They'd see the torn-up casings, and that's it. Penal battalion at best.
"Faster," Ivanov urged.
I hear a car. Indeed, from the rear, breaking through the roar of the engine, the sound of an approaching vehicle could be heard. A Willis or a Gaz 67. The brass. They always arrive when everything is already over, to count losses and hand out reprimands. Soldiers shoveled casings into a dirty poncho. The clink of metal on metal seemed like a tolling bell to Ivanov. It seemed to him that this ringing could be heard in Berlin and Moscow. 20 casings, 20 proofs that Sergeant Ivanov was smarter than the People's Commissariat of Defense. Such things are not forgiven. "Everything?" he asked, looking over the trench bottom. "Seems like everything," the carrier exhaled, tying a knot on the tarp. "Drag it to the crater. Move!" The soldier darted to the edge of the position, dragging the heavy bundle. He pushed it into a fresh shell crater and began furiously throwing earth over it with his hands, breaking his nails.
Ivanov stood by the gun, trying to bring himself to regulation appearance.
He buttoned his tunic collar, adjusted his belt. His hands were black. There was nothing to wash them with. His face, a chimney sweep's mask. But his eyes, in his eyes, that cold fire with which he burned the tigers still stood. He looked at the field. 14 smoky pillars propped up the sky. This was his report, his dispatch. No paper could say more than these burning chunks of Krupp steel. He did the impossible. He stopped the breakthrough. But inside, under the tunic, his heart pounded not from pride. It pounded from the understanding. Now the second part of the ballet begins. And in it, his opponent won't be a German tanker whom he respected as an enemy, but his own Soviet rear echelon officer, with clean shoulder boards and an instruction manual instead of a brain. The sound of the engine became very close. A door slammed. Voices were heard.
Commanding, sharp, well-fed voices of people who hadn't gone deaf from shooting today. Ivanov straightened up. He put his hand on the gun breech. The metal still burned his palm. It was the only support he had left. The cannon was his accomplice. They committed this crime together, and now they waited for the verdict together. "Crew, attention!" he commanded, though there was no need. The soldiers stood frozen anyway, looking at the parapet, from behind which a peaked cap with a red band appeared. The silence ended. The interrogation began. The Willies jumped over a bump and braked sharply right at the parapet. The engine sneezed and died. The ensuing silence was heavy, official. Out of the car climbed the battalion commander, a captain with a bandaged head, and another man in a clean, unnaturally green tunic with cornflower blue tabs. Military jurist 3rd class. Prosecutor's office. Ivanov stood at attention. His dirty, sweat and soot-soaked uniform looked like a beggar's rags against the background of the jurist's pressed tunic. The crew froze behind the sergeant's back, eyes lowered. They felt guilt, not for what they did, but for getting caught. The battalion commander looked over the field. His single, healthy eye widened. The panorama of destruction was grandiose. 14 black pillars of smoke. Mangled iron, which an hour ago was the elite of the Wehrmacht, now cluttered the horizon. "Your work, Ivanov?" the captain asked hoarsely. "Yes, sir, comrade captain. The crew's work." 14 of them. The captain shook his head. "Hell, you should get a hero star." "You should." The dry, creaky voice of the jurist sliced the air like a scalpel. "Or get shot. That is what we are about to find out." The prosecutor didn't look at the burning tanks. He wasn't interested in the result of the battle. He was interested in the process. He stepped into the trench, squeamishly stepping around pools of oil and blood. His gaze slid over the position, fixing details invisible to the ordinary eye. The red-hot barrel with paint hanging off in tatters. The mountain of spent casings that the soldiers didn't finish burying. Fresh clay treacherously crumbled, exposing yellow brass sides. He bent down and picked up one casing. It was that very one. The special one. The one they missed in the rush. It had rolled under the carriage spade and now lay on the prosecutor's palm as heavy physical evidence. The jurist brought the casing to his eyes. He ran a finger over the neck. The metal was scratched. Marks from pliers' jaws were distinct, rough. A factory machine leaves a smooth mark. A human worked here. Worked crudely, violating the geometry of the ammunition. Arbitrariness, the jurist stated. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. Article 58, Section 14. Counter-revolutionary sabotage, intentional damage to military property. He threw the casing at Ivanov's feet. It clinked like a coin thrown in a face. "Explain, Sergeant." The prosecutor's voice was quiet, but steel rang in that quiet. "Who gave you the right to interfere with the construction of a unitary cartridge? Are you an engineer? Are you a designer?" "No, sir." Ivanov looked straight ahead. "Senior Sergeant Ivanov, 7th grade education." 7th grade, the jurist sneered. "And this 7th grade decided it was smarter than the technical department of the People's Commissariat of Defense? Do you understand what you did? You changed the powder charge. You violated ballistics. You risked the lives of the personnel and the integrity of the material part. The cannon could have exploded." "It didn't explode, though," the loader grumbled from behind. "Silence!" the prosecutor barked, spinning around sharply. "I am not talking to you." I am talking to a criminal! The battalion commander tried to intervene. He saw the burning tanks, and for him, the arithmetic of war was simple. Enemy destroyed, position held. Comrade military jurist, he began cautiously. Victors aren't judged. They fought off the attack. If not for them, we wouldn't be standing here right now. The Tigers would be drinking coffee in regimental HQ. Victors aren't judged in fairy tales, Captain. The prosecutor cut him off. In the Red Army, they are judged by the manual. Today he poured off powder. Tomorrow he'll file down the breech block. And the day after he'll start shooting his own men? Discipline is the foundation. And here I see anarchy. He turned back to Ivanov. His gaze was tenacious, cold. It was the gaze of a man who sees the world through the prism of paragraphs and instructions. For him, Ivanov's feat wasn't heroism, but a dangerous precedent. If every sergeant starts inventing their own shells, the army will turn into a rabble. Why did you do it? He asked. Did you know that disassembling standard ammunition is forbidden under penalty of court-martial? I knew, Ivanov answered. And you did it anyway. Why? Ivanov closed his eyes for a second. How to explain the smell of fear to this man in a clean uniform? How to explain the trembling of the earth when 50 tons of death are coming at you? How to explain that the manual was written in warm offices, but you have to die in a damp trench? The standard shell didn't take the armor, Ivanov said. He spoke slowly, weighing every word. Ricochets. We hit point blank. Useless. There were 2 ways out. Either die by the manual, or violate it and survive. I chose the second. You chose a crime, the jurist parried. You ruined state property. 20 shells. Do you understand that this is sabotage? I burned 14 tanks, Ivanov nodded toward the field. Each one costs millions, and I spent 20 casings and half a kilo of powder. The arithmetic is in our favor, citizen jurist. The prosecutor's face went red in spots. Such insolence didn't fit into his worldview. The suspect wasn't making excuses. He was bargaining. He was putting his criminal actions and their result on the scales. Don't give me that demagoguery! The jurist broke into a scream. You put the gun at risk. The only gun in the sector. If the barrel had burst, who would hold the defense? The corpses of your men? If we hadn't fired the specials, we would have been flattened by tracks in 5 minutes. Ivanov's voice became hard. And the gun would have perished. And us. And you would be running all the way to Kursk right now. So the gun is intact. The crew is intact. The mission is accomplished. And the casings, write them off as combat losses. The prosecutor choked with indignation. He unbuttoned his holster. The gesture was theatrical, but the threat was real. I am arresting you now, Sergeant, and sending you to the tribunal. There they will quickly explain to you the difference between heroism and arbitrariness. Surrender your weapon. The crew growled deeply. The soldiers took a step forward, shielding their commander. It was a mutiny. Quiet, but terrible. Men who had gone through hell 20 minutes ago weren't afraid of a jurist's pistol. They looked at him with heavy, angry gazes. The battalion commander stepped between them. Stand down, he bellowed. Ivanov, surrender your personal weapon. That's an order. Comrade military jurist, let's have no lynching here. We'll file a report. Report to division. Let them decide there. It's not right to tie up a hero of the battle in front of the formation. Ivanov slowly took the TT pistol from his holster. heavy, warm metal. He put the pistol on the gun carriage trail, next to that very criminal casing. "Take it," he said. It wouldn't have helped me against a tiger anyway, but my head did. Pity the manual says nothing about heads. The jurist hid the pistol in his breeches pocket. He had won. The law triumphed. The violator was disarmed. The protocol would be drawn up. The machine of justice creaked its gears, preparing to grind Sergeant Ivanov's fate just as ruthlessly as his shells ground German armor. "In the car," the prosecutor commanded. "To the division's special department. They'll sort it out there." Ivanov adjusted his side cap. He looked at his men. "Clean the gun," he said mundanely, as if leaving for lunch. "Inspect the barrel for cracks. Prepare for battle. The Germans might return." "What about you, Comrade Commander?" the gunner asked, swallowing tears. "And I'll go talk to the brass. Explain physics to them." He walked to the Willies without looking back. Straight back, broad shoulders. A man who had just won a duel with death, but lost a duel with paper. The battalion commander watched him go, then spat into the dust and glared at the prosecutor. "If they shoot him," the captain said quietly, "I will personally write a report to Stalin himself." "Right away," the jurist threw out indifferently, sitting in the front seat. "Paper can endure anything, but there must be order." The car tore off, kicking up clouds of dust. Ivanov sat in the back seat, squeezed between crates of ammo. He looked at the receding position, at his gun, at his people. He regretted nothing. Even if they put him against the wall, he knew he had bought his country another day of life, and the price of 20 ruined casings was laughably small. Ahead was division headquarters, the tribunal, and the unknown, which was scarier than a German attack because you couldn't shoot back at it. Division headquarters was located in a dugout deep under 3 layers of logs. Here it smelled of dampness, expensive Kazbek tobacco, and the printer's ink of fresh maps. A lamp under a green shade picked out a table littered with reports from the gloom. In the corner, under the guard of a sentry, sat Senior Sergeant Ivanov. He hadn't slept for 2 days. His face had turned into a gray mask, eyes sunken, hands lying on his knees, still preserving the ingrained blackness of powder residue. On the table in front of the division commander, a heavy-set colonel with an unbuttoned collar, lay the object of dispute. A brass casing with a roughly crimped neck. Next to it lay the military jurist's report. The paper demanded blood. Article, paragraph, section. Execution. "Sabotage," the prosecutor hammered out, pacing the dugout. His boots squeaked like ungreased hinges. "Intentional rendering of ammunition unusable is evident. The sergeant arbitrarily changed the construction of the round. This is undermining combat readiness in frontline conditions. I demand a show trial, so others don't get the idea to twist nuts instead of fighting war." The colonel was silent. He smoked a cigarette, knocking ash straight onto the floor. He was more interested in another paper, the report of enemy losses in the 2nd Battery's sector. 14 tanks. 14 Tigers and Panthers that should have broken the front and entered the division's rear, but instead were burning in the steppe. "Get me the engineer," the colonel said dully. "Let the tech guy speak. Legally, I understand you. Now I want to hear the physics." A minute later, a lieutenant colonel of the engineering service entered the dugout. Horn-rimmed glasses, ink-stained fingers, the look of a tired professor yanked from a lecture to a slaughterhouse. He picked up the casing, examined it from all sides, sniffed it, took a caliper from his pocket, measured the neck deformation. "Well?" The prosecutor rushed him. Confirm that it's defective. That it's dangerous for the gun. The engineer was silent for a long time. He weighed the casing in his hand, as if assessing a gold nugget. Then he walked up to Ivanov. "How much did you pour off?" he asked quietly. "A third, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," the sergeant answered hoarsely. "By eye. Felt it by weight." "Primer standard?" "Standard." The engineer returned to the table. He took out a notepad and a pencil stub. For several minutes, only the scratch of graphite on paper was heard in the dugout. Formulas. Gas pressure, chamber volume, powder burn curve. It was a trial of physics over bureaucracy. "It's not a defect," the engineer finally said, raising his eyes to the colonel. It's engineering arrogance bordering on genius." The prosecutor choked on air. "What are you spouting, Lieutenant Colonel? He ruined the shell." "He adapted it." The engineer tapped the casing with the pencil. "Look, the cumulative shell BP-350M has thin walls. It's calculated for low pressure in the short barrel of a regimental gun. If you shove it into a long Zis-3 with a full charge, the G-force upon firing will crush it like a tin can. Or it detonates right in the bore." The engineer swept his gaze over those present. The sergeant reduced the powder charge. He lowered the peak pressure in the breech. The pressure graph became flatter. The shell got a soft push. Velocity dropped, yes. Trajectory flatness worsened. But a shaped charge shell doesn't need velocity. It just needs to arrive. Ivanov intuitively found that single balance where the shell doesn't disintegrate and the gun doesn't burst. "And effectiveness?" the colonel asked, leaning forward. 100%, the engineer shrugged. "The shell arrives intact. The fuse works. Armor penetration doesn't depend on flight speed. You could apply it by hand. It would burn through." The sergeant turned a divisional gun into a sniper rifle for destroying tanks at point-blank range. "Technically, it's a flawless solution. Risky, yes, but in the given conditions, the only correct one." Silence hung in the dugout. You could hear a fly buzzing, beating against the lamp glass. The prosecutor stood red as a lobster. His logic, built on paragraphs, had just shattered against strength of materials and gas dynamics. "But the manual," he began uncertainly. "To hell with the manual." The colonel slammed his fist on the table. The casing jumped and rolled across the maps, stopping on the front line. The colonel stood up. He walked up to Ivanov. The sergeant tried to stand at attention, but his legs trembled from fatigue. "Do you understand what you did, Sergeant?" the colonel asked, looking him in the eye. "Yes, sir. Ruined 20 casings." "You're a fool, Ivanov," the colonel grinned, and in that grin, for the first time that day, something human flashed. "You didn't ruin casings. You saved our asses, the divisions and the armies." The colonel turned to the table, picked up the prosecutor's report. Slowly, with relish, he tore it into 4 pieces. The paper scraps fell to the earthen floor. "Here is the situation." The colonel's voice became hard, commanding. "Case closed for lack of corpus delicti. Write off the casings as expended in combat. And this method," he turned to the engineer. "Lieutenant Colonel, can you calculate the exact charge? Not by eye, but by science, so we can write an instruction?" "Yes, sir, Comrade Colonel. I need 2 hours and scales." "Then get to it. By morning the instruction must be in all regiments. And you, Sergeant." Ivanov waited. He still didn't believe it. The silence in the dugout pressed on his ears. "Citation for a medal," the colonel threw to the adjutant sitting in the corner. Write it up. For displayed courage, ingenuity, and destruction of superior enemy forces. I recommend for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Comrade Colonel, the prosecutor flared up. He is a criminal. What hero? Victors aren't judged, jurist. The colonel cut him off. You heard the engineer? It's genius. And geniuses we must protect, not shoot. We have plenty of tanks on the other side, but few Ivanovs. The colonel walked to a cabinet, took out a bottle of captured cognac, and poured half a glass. Drink, Sergeant. Ivanov took the glass with a shaking hand. The smell of alcohol hit his nose, overpowering the smell of gunpowder. He drank it in one gulp, not feeling the taste. Warmth spread through his veins, releasing the icy knot in his stomach. Thank you, Comrade Colonel. Go sleep, Ivanov. Tomorrow the war continues, and now we know how to fight it. Ivanov walked out of the dugout. Fresh night air hit his face. The sky over the Kursk salient was dark, but somewhere on the horizon, dawn was already breaking. The dawn of a new day in which his gun was no longer a powerless stick. In the dugout, the engineer was already laying out a slide rule on the table, preparing to turn the intuition of a sergeant with a 7th-grade education into a dry, precise directive for the entire Red Army. The truth of war defeated paper. Common sense defeated fear. Engineering calculation, multiplied by soldiers' courage, turned out to be tougher than any German armor. It was a victory. Not loud, with flags and orchestras, but a quiet, technical victory. A victory of mind over hopelessness. Sergeant Ivanov didn't just survive. He hacked the code of war, changing the rules of the game right on the battlefield. And now, all the artillerymen of the front had to learn these new rules. And the German tankers, too. Only, for the latter, this lesson would be the last. July 23, 1943, Front Artillery Headquarters. The clatter of telegraph machines that day sounded different.
It didn't sound like a report on losses, but like a death sentence to German tank wedges. Along the wires, through thousands of kilometers of copper vein, flew a directive. A dry, typewritten text, certified by a stamped seal and the commander's signature. This document contained no pathetic calls of, "Not one step back!" It had no ideology. It had pure physics. Technical instruction on modifying ammunition in field conditions. The experience of Senior Sergeant Ivanov, gained in a dirty trench under fear of execution, became law for the entire Red Army. What yesterday was considered a criminal offense, sabotage, damage to state property, today became the only way to survive. Thousands of artillery crews from Orel to Belgorod received this order. Battery commanders opened packets with wax seals. They read the instruction written by that very engineer lieutenant colonel who in one night translated the sergeant's intuition into the language of formulas and grams. For firing the cumulative shell BP-350M from the ZIS-3 gun, produce a reduction of the propellant charge. Open the casing. Remove a powder bundle weighing. Crimp the neck. It was the legalization of trench engineering. A massive operation to modernize weapons right on the front line. Not in the factories of the Urals, where machines worked 3 shifts, but here, in damp dugouts, to the accompaniment of German bombings. Soldiers who yesterday cursed their useless guns were today turning them into tiger killers. For the first time in the history of war, the initiative of a loner, multiplied by technical literacy, changed the balance of forces at a strategic level. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. German tankers, accustomed to impunity at distances over 500 meters, suddenly discovered that the rules of the game had changed.
Their armor, that vaunted Krupp steel they considered absolute protection, began to burn. Russian guns, which previously only scratched the paint, now burned through sides and fronts, causing ammo rack detonations. Wehrmacht loss statistics crawled up in a vertical line. Tigers ceased to be masters of the battlefield. They turned into game. Hunter and victim swapped places, not thanks to a new cannon that needed years to develop, but thanks to a simple brass casing in which there was less powder, but more sense. And Sergeant Ivanov himself? He didn't become a general. He didn't sit in presidiums. He remained who he was, a soldier doing his job. He was handed the Hero of the Soviet Union star in August, in front of the formation of his thinned-out regiment. He accepted the award silently, without unnecessary words. For him, this star wasn't a piece of gold, but a memory of those 20 casings and the trembling hands pouring out death on the scales of fate. The war for him didn't end at the Kursk salient. It rolled further west. Ivanov crossed the Dnieper, where his crew ferried the gun on rafts under dagger fire. He marched through Poland, liberating cities whose names he could barely pronounce. He entered Germany. Berlin, May 1945. Ivanov stood by the soot-stained wall of the Reichstag. Around him reigned the chaos of victory. Shooting in the air, shouts, accordion music, the intoxicating smell of lilacs and burning. But Ivanov didn't shoot. He smoked, squinting from the smoke, and looked at the smashed German equipment cluttering the streets. There, among the ruins, stood the carcass of a king tiger. A gigantic, monstrous tank, the pinnacle of Nazi tank building. Its armor was even thicker, its gun even more powerful. But in the side of the turret gaped a neat, melted hole. A mark from a shaped charge shell. The work of one of Ivanov's students. Someone who also read that very directive and understood there are no unsolvable tasks. There is only a lack of ingenuity and an excess of fear. Ivanov walked up to the tank. He ran his hand over the cold, dead steel. The armor lost. Metal, no matter how thick, always loses to living human thought. This was the main lesson of war he had learned. Caliber doesn't decide the outcome of a battle, not the thickness of the frontal plate. The outcome is decided by the person looking into the sight, a person capable of breaking the rules to rewrite them. After the war, Ivanov returned home, to a small settlement near Voronezh. He didn't go around schools telling of his feats. He wrote no memoirs. He worked as a mechanic at a machine tractor station, repaired tractors, seeders, combines. His hands, which once assembled deadly shells, now returned life to peaceful machines. But sometimes, at night, when a thunderstorm rumbled over the roof, he woke up in a cold sweat. He dreamed not of Berlin and not of the victory parade. He dreamed of the July heat of '43, the smell of wormwood and gunpowder, the weight of a brass casing in his hand, and that very moment of choice: remain a function man and perish, or become a creator man and win. The story of Sergeant Ivanov is not just an episode of the Great Patriotic War. It is a formula for survival. When the system fails, when the enemy's technical superiority seems absolute, when the manual leads to a dead end, a special mode engages. The mode of engineering rage. We often speak of heroism as sacrifice, as readiness to throw oneself on an embrasure. But true heroism can be quiet, calculated, and professional. Heroism is knowing your specs and the enemy's specs.
Heroism is understanding the physics of the process. Heroism is taking responsibility for a non-standard solution when the price of a mistake is death. The Kursk salient became a grave for the Panzerwaffe not only because of the courage of the infantry. It became a grave because a simple Russian sergeant with a 7th-grade education turned out to be smarter than the design bureau of the Henschel firm. He found a vulnerability in the system. He turned his weapon's disadvantage into its advantage. The old ZS-3, the workhorse the Germans had written off, turned out to be an instrument of retribution. Not because it was perfect, but because it ended up in the right hands. Ivanov finished smoking his cigarette and crushed the butt with his boot. Just as he once crushed the fear of the court-martial. He knew, armor is just iron, but the mind is a weapon that cannot be bent, broken, or pierced. As long as there are people capable of pouring off powder by eye under tiger fire, capable of thinking when others only panic, this army cannot be defeated. Not by any technology, not by any Wunderwaffe. Because war is, above all, a competition of intellects. And in this competition, Sergeant Ivanov won a clean, technical victory by knockout. The directive of July 23, 1943 remained in the archives as a yellowed sheet of paper. But the spirit of that directive lives on. It is an eternal reminder. There are no hopeless situations. There are only engineering tasks that require a bold solution. And if anyone ever tells you that resistance is useless, that the force is on the enemy's side, that there are no chances, remember Sergeant Ivanov. Remember the 20 casings. And just start looking for a solution. It is always there. Somewhere out there, beyond the border of fear and the manual.